Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Michelle Maloney, and I'm the co-founder and one of the directors of the New Economy Network Australia, or NENA, as we so fondly call her. This week, we're super duper excited to be hosting a range of events celebrating World Localisation Day, which actually happens to be today. So hooray for World Localisation Day. First, I'd like to acknowledge country. I am very, very delighted to now live, work and play in the beautiful lands of the Gubbi Gubbi and Jinnaburra peoples. It's a part of southeast Queensland, if anyone knows of it. It's now a suburb called Narangba, and it's part of the Moreton Bay Council area. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and emerging leaders and young people who continue the traditions of one of the oldest continuous cultures on earth. In NENA, we'd like to acknowledge two things. Country was never ceded. It always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. And we also like to acknowledge our commitment to being part of a decolonising process here across this glorious continent, which basically means how do we all become better earthlings and better people committed to caring for country in this continent, shaking off some of the less fabulous attributes of, I guess, a Eurocentric invader type of well-being, worldview, sorry, stuttering, not enough coffee, and trying to embrace the very essence of localization, which some folks like Yin Paradise and others would call indigenizing ourselves into place, into our bioregions. And it's an exciting path, definitely, to be part of. But today is event number 3 in 5 events that NENA is hosting for Localisation Week. I'm really delighted. I'll actually talk a little bit later, perhaps towards the end, about some of our other localisation events, but just flag with you tomorrow lunchtime, we have a housing webinar, localising our housing responses to the current crisis in Australia. And on Friday, I'm excited that Mary Graham, Indigenous elder and political scientist from the Yugambeh language group, will be joining me in a discussion about governance for localisation. And she is one of the most amazing speakers able to articulate what she calls that pan-Aboriginal custodial governance system, both pre and existing since settler times. But yes, on with the show today. I'm really delighted to have 3 excellent speakers with us. We've got Nick Rose from Sustain, Callum Rogers from a number of different groups, and Henry Coleman, who's with Local Futures. So thank you so much for joining us. And what we'll do is I might hand over to Nick Rose. We'll start with Nick, who'll give a short talk, and then we'll go to Callum and then to Henry, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A at the end. So thank you, everybody. And if you do have questions, please write them in the chat for now. And when we go into Q&A, we'll go through those questions and have a good old chat. Thanks very much. Over to you, Nick. He's ready to go.
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. It's great to be with you this afternoon, supporting NENA. Just like to acknowledge the great work that Michelle has done over so many years with NENA and AELA in really championing the space of the new economy, ecological sustainability, decolonisation. You know, Michelle is a real leader in this space and has been for a long time. So always happy to support Michelle and the team at NENA, and it's great to be part of Localisation Day today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri, Woi Wurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and join with Michelle in acknowledging that this was and always will be Aboriginal land. So yeah, it's great to see so many people joining us this afternoon, a couple of familiar faces. For those who don't know me, this is just a little bit of backstory, I guess, about how I got into the whole space of food systems, urban agriculture, food politics, food movements, and led to the founding of Sustain, the Australian Food Network, in 2016. These are some slides from, or some pictures rather, of people that I met on a Churchill Fellowship, which is a fantastic experience. If anybody ever gets the opportunity to throw your hat in that particular ring, I definitely would encourage you to do it. I was lucky enough to be a Churchill Fellow for New South Wales, selected in 2013, travelled in 2014 to the US Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, to Toronto in Canada, and then 5 provinces in Argentina. And these are just some of the wonderful people I met in my investigation into innovative models of urban agriculture to address livelihood challenges and food security challenges for disadvantaged urban populations. And that's really been both an inspiration and a guiding compass in the work that I and my team have done since 2016 in founding Sustain, the Australian Food Network, as a national sustainable food systems organisation, health promotion charity. We speak of ourselves as a think and do network, designing and building better food systems through research, through policy development, through community engagement, through network building and events, and by walking the talk through actually establishing and operating urban farms. So that's a little bit about us. Why does this matter? Why should we be paying attention to food systems? Well, these are just, some headlines over the last couple of years that really make the case that we are living through a series of converging crises. I think the Earth is giving us a pretty strong message that we need to be changing direction pretty fundamentally. And food and agriculture is at the heart of many of our converging crises, if not all of them. If we think about species loss, land use change, deforestation, soil degradation, through to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, through to health crises, chronic disease, through to the succession crisis amongst farmers and the way they are oppressed through the supermarket duopoly, through to the growing cost of living crisis right now with the cycle of interest rate rises and the inflationary dynamic that we're in, and the suffering and distress being experienced by growing numbers of Australian families, through to factory farming. Anywhere you turn, a lot of it comes back, if not most of it, to the way we produce, manufacture, distribute, consume and waste food. So that's why this matters. And the situation is getting more serious, if anything, in 2023, with, of course, the global geopolitical context. I'm sure many of you are aware that Ukraine and Russia themselves are huge food producers, grains, sunflower oil, as well as producers of fertilizer. So the geopolitical uncertainty and the prospect of widening war is another reason why we should be talking about localizing our food systems, getting closer to where our food is coming from. So that's the big picture and the reasons to pay attention to this. I just wanted to share with you this image of incredible edible Todmorden. Some of you might have heard of this initiative that was started over a decade ago by 2 women running cafes in the small Yorkshire Dales village of Todmorden. And Pam Warhurst, in her presentation to the Community Gardens Australia annual gathering last November, had these words to say in thinking about what a localised and transformed food system might look like. She says, long banished to the periphery of our existence, food would once more occupy centre stage. Architects and planners would no longer design flats without kitchens, neighbourhoods without allotments, or cities without farms and orchards. Instead, the race would be on to post-fit our homes, public spaces and places of work with the life-giving animation of food. Home life would revolve around kitchens and gardens, cooking, shared meals and community compost heaps. Markets and high streets would flourish. Gardens and balconies would burst with produce, and networks of small producers and suppliers would once again connect cities with their local hinterlands. Farmers would be incentivised to work with nature, not against it. Industrial feedlots and big ag would be replaced by networks of smaller scale mixed use regenerative farms, prioritising soil health, biodiversity and carbon and water capture. Food chains and businesses would morph from the often dehumanized, exploitative operations of today to become ecologically sound, crafts-based and social. And that is a vision of food systems localization, which Pam and the now global movement of Incredible Edible and so many other movements like it are bringing into reality. In the context of our work, we did a piece of research in the first year of the pandemic. In 2020, we had the Pandemic Gardening Survey open for 30 days. And in those 30 days in June 2020, over 9,000 Australians completed it. I'll share the link in the chat shortly to that report if you haven't seen it. It really is a powerful testament to just how important access to green spaces and particularly gardens in both backyards, front yards, streetscapes, community gardens, school gardens were and are to people. And on the strength of that massive evidence base, we put forward a demand for the creation of a $500 million National Edible Gardening Fund and part of the justification for that was as an investment in preventative health in Australia on the basis that we as taxpayers are spending over $200 billion every year. And those are 2019 figures, just in dealing with the impacts of dietary-related ill health and mental illness. I'm very pleased to say that that call for a $500 million Edible Gardening Fund or Urban Agriculture Fund was in fact embraced by the New South Wales Greens in the Sustainable Food Systems Plan they took to the New South Wales election in March this year, alongside a call for a $300 million centre for regenerative agriculture to support farmers to make the transition to regen ag. In terms of leading places in the world, I'd like to acknowledge the leadership of Michelle Wu and her vision of food justice and urban agriculture in the city of Boston. She ran for mayor in 2020 with a 66-page food justice agenda for a resilient Boston, which was the result of years of listening and responding to community needs around nutrition, land use, and economic development. Her agenda is designed to go beyond access to pursue food justice, which she says includes community control of land for community food, dismantling systems that oppress food chain workers and elevate white supremacy, and creating real economic opportunity for all Bostonians, especially those in BIPOC communities, to create food businesses and build assets and wealth. And that's an example of strong local leadership for localized food systems based in a massive expansion of urban agriculture. That's the agenda that we want to see and promote in Victoria and right around Australia. So this is some research we published last year, commissioned by Agriculture Victoria, the state government, to do a first ever survey of the urban agriculture sector in Victoria. Again, that's published on our website. I'll share the link shortly. But these are some of the opportunities that young urban farmers such as Callum and community gardeners said to us in terms of opportunities to really scale up this space, growing food on school properties, on Department of Education land, localizing food economies and building jobs for the new green economy. And in terms of decolonisation and connection to country, have this lovely quote from Barkanji artist Zena Cumpston, how Aboriginal perspectives can shape new landscapes. And here she talks about country being expressed in rooftop native plantings as part of the development of our cities in this decade and going through this century, which I think is a really fantastic vision. So in terms of some of the recommendations, some of our roadmap and our agenda for change, we want to see a right to farm in the city. We want planning reform to create dedicated urban agriculture zones. We want to see food as part of vital city infrastructure. And we want to normalise community access to public land. And I noticed that Gavin Hardy's on the webinar today, and he did a great piece of investigation looking at community food forests where those kinds of things are happening all around the world. This needs to be resourced. You know, this work is work and should be valued as such, we believe, and there's all kinds of ways in which that can be done. So these are some of the suggestions that we've made in terms of actually creating the funding and the resourcing to really build a large workforce for a mass expansion of urban agriculture across Australia. Just want to mention some other work that we've done with local government in Victoria. This is the Cardinia Food Circles project, a long-term food systems change agenda beginning in November 2016. A huge achievement was in 2018-19 with the creation of the Cardinia Community Food Strategy. And Cardinia Shire Council are now implementing that for the next 7 to 8 years. And you see there, growing a vibrant local food economy is a cornerstone of that approach. And this is some recent work that we've been doing with other local governments in and around Melbourne and also regionally with Ballarat, updating City of Melbourne's food policy, working with the City of Casey to create their first ever food security framework for action, and working with the City of Ballarat to create their first local food coalition with 20 community food leaders. So there you see the aims of that collaborative effort. And here are some further examples of already established local food coalitions and networks in Victoria and also elsewhere, one of which is Food Fairness Illawarra, a member organisation of Sustain that has been established for nearly 20 years. And here you see what they do across network building, advocacy, education, research, and governance. And I'm just going to finish off by highlighting some of the work we're doing on the ground. This is in Preston, in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, taking custodianship of an abandoned vicarage that is the property of the Anglican Church, an 800 square metre house and garden, your typical quarter-acre Aussie suburban block. We took that over in 2021 when there were 4 edible species growing, and now we have over 120. And we have transformed that space into the Oak Hill Food Justice Farm, partnering with the local primary school, with the local food security agency Diverse, running paid youth internships, setting up a community and small business composting hub, and much more. And I'm just going to finish by sharing with you a video that we've put together, because this land is now for sale, and in terms of actually localizing our food system, and as I put it in an anthology that I wrote a few years ago called Reclaiming the Urban Commons, we have an opportunity to continue doing what we're doing there, but if the land is sold to a developer, all of that will be turned into concrete and steel and glass and become townhouses. So we are right now running a campaign to raise the funds to continue this as a beacon project for reimagining urban streetscapes around Australia. So I'll finish with this short 3-minute video. Okay. That's me done. Thanks, Mish.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was excellent. There are some questions for you, which we will come back to, but one that a number of folks have asked personally and in the public chat is that beautiful quote that you read out. Is there a link for that? Is there a way people could get their hands on a written version of it? Or would you like me to arrange for it to be transcribed from your reading of it?
The Pam Warhurst quote, you mean?
Yes.
That was in her presentation to the Community Gardens Australia. So it was my writing of what she said. But I can check with Naomi Lacey, who's CGA president, and if Pam's willing to share it, I'm sure she'd be happy to do that.
That would be lovely. And if you do let me access it, what I might do is put it on the NENA website. Has all of our different sectoral hubs has a web page, and we'll pop it onto the food page so that people can find it and access it. And Nick, some of your recommendations and statements about what the future of food systems should look like in Australia, we'd love to make sure we get them onto the NENA website too. So if anyone's looking for that, let me know. Otherwise, Nick, perhaps you could also put in the links, the best ways for people to access your material on your website or to contact you, etc., etc.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was really wonderful. And now I'm really happy to hand over to Callum Rogers. Callum, thanks so much for joining us, and please do share with us whatever you wish about the food systems work you're looking at.
Thank you so much. And you'll have to forgive me, I've got a bit of a cold at the moment, but I will get through it. And it feels really good to be here with you all as someone that works as a farmer day to day. I'm very stuck in the micro and the local, which is very relevant, but to be here with a group of people all across the nation, feels heartening and inspiring. My name is Callum. I'm here representing an urban farming duo called the Veggie Empire, as well as the cooperative that they and myself are a part of called Caring Farms Cooperative. We are an urban farm cooperative and social enterprise. And I suppose why I'm speaking today is that Caring Farms provides an example of an urban farm providing food and veggie seedlings to our local community, while also being a place of community and belonging to people who would otherwise be marginalized from those spaces. Providing an example of the opportunities of local food futures, but both materially, but also socially as well. So the journey of what we do starts with these three people, and with all great things, it starts with relationships. So we've got Scott, Rachel, and Josh here. Josh and Scott are two men that live with intellectual and some physical disabilities. And they met Rachel at a course geared towards providing people with disabilities learning opportunities in horticulture. And together, they did that about 10 years ago. Together, they built what is Caring Farms Cooperative. But I'll talk about that a bit in a second. We are located here in northeast Melbourne on what is and always will be Wurundjeri Willam country. So Wurundjeri being the clan, and then Willam being the local subsection of that clan. So they are a part of the Boiwurrung language group and the Coleman Nation. And where we are, we straddle two LGAs. So on one side, we've got Nillumbik, which is a Boiwurrung word for shallow soil. And on the other side, we've got Banyul, which is a Boiwurrung word for hill. And while I talk about it being Indigenous land, I'd like to highlight that as a group, we pay the rent. So a proportion of all of our earnings go to Indigenous owned and operated organisations as an act of ongoing solidarity and in recognition that we do operate on stolen land. And we encourage all groups to do something similar as a concrete action of solidarity. So where the farm is on Vic Road's land, on a parcel of land that's called, on paper, called F7, Freeway 7. Essentially, it was going to be a route for a large freeway out here in the northeastern suburbs called the North East Link. It wasn't taken, so it's now being what's called land banked, where the land is too valuable to sell off at this stage in case that they want to use it, but is not being used. So here we are. Originally, we had a lease of land from Hayden McLean, a man with quite severe autism that was able to secure a lease from Vic Roads. we developed a relationship with him, and he decided to sublet his land to us, but now we go directly through Vic Roads. I should have had some before and after pictures here, but this land was largely blackberry ridden and with quite, well, containers and containers worth of dumped rubbish. So the first about 3 years of what we were doing was mainly clearing that. And this is where we are now. So we operate a small scale market garden, a food plant nursery. We do quite significant revegetation works and a worm farming business. So our market garden produces vegetables to two local greengrocers, a cafe and a restaurant, as well as to Green Hills Neighbourhood House, which is our local neighbourhood house that runs a food relief program. And we're in the process of expansion, and we'll be starting a CSA box, which is community supported agriculture, in the coming spring season. So community supported agriculture being when people will pay up front at the start of the year for a box, which gives us the capital to then be able to provide them with the veggies throughout the season. We also do a food plant nursery. So these are things that are perfectly suited to Josh and Scott's skill set. We provide retail punnets to our local community through Alvington Farmers Market. But just as importantly, we do things called seed starts for other urban farms, urban and peri-urban farms within the Melbourne Food Bowl. So we grow these farm trays that they will then grow on at their own farms. We do worm farming, so we divert about, calculated yesterday, about a tonne's worth of food waste every year from our greengrocers, which we then use the worm castings on our land. And due to our kind of business model, it means that we're able to do revegetation works, which otherwise would not be financially viable.
Sorry to interrupt, Callum. I do apologise. Are you sharing screen? Because we can't see your screen.
Oh no! Oh, that's a bummer.
I'm really sorry.
No, you're totally fine. That was my mistake. I'll just quickly show you all the images.
Actually, don't have to go too fast. Could you show us the one you were talking about with the not blueberries, blackberry bushes?
Blackberry.
And yeah, if you've got to be,
I don't actually have the before and after. It's something I should provide, but this is what the land looks like now. If you can imagine, essentially what was just an open field with large piles of blackberries that hid large pieces of debris. So burnt out cars, couches, heaps amount of building rubble that we've slowly carted off the site and replaced with, our market garden nursery in the middle there, and revegetation works around the edges. This is an image from our market garden, and there we go. We've got a bit of a before and after in that left-hand part of the slide, which shows what it looked like to where we've got to now. We've just taken on an extra acre of land. So that means we're able to expand and put in things like this shipping container that will be used for our CSA box. That's Scott doing our nursery work. And these are a little section of the farms that we do those seed starts to, and images of the worm farming and revegetation works. The project was set up by Josh, Scott, and the advocate Rachel. So as I mentioned previously, Josh and Scott have been marginalised from the workforce and were essentially languishing in daycare, which is has a role to play, but is essentially group disability care, not personalised and doesn't provide opportunities for workplace or purpose in many respects. So when they met Rachel, they latched onto her because she provided them opportunities, and together they built what is now Caring Farms Cooperative. But as a duo, they go under the Veggie Empire. So they use their NDIS funding to bring in people like me, or what we call supported culturalists. So I am at the farm part of the time. I'm there to support Josh and Scott to be able to participate in the business, but also I'm also there as a farmer on the other days. And this is the group, so Josh, Scott and Rachel in the middle, and then the supported culturalists on the outside. And I guess when we talk about localization, and Nick mentioned it, there's the localization of food systems, but then there's also the localization of decision making. So it was really important to us to form a cooperative. Well, we formed 2 cooperatives, so we can have community control of this piece of land. And it's especially important for Josh and Scott to have a say in how this business that they've been so integral in setting up, they can have a democratic control in. And we've taken inspiration from places like Nunda Community Enterprises Cooperative up in Brisbane that have done similar things in the disability space. But yeah, just as importantly as what we do is that we exist within a network of other urban and peri-urban farms. And I feel very grateful and inspired to exist within such a network of so many of these. There are groups of people that are running, in many cases, thriving farms in urban spaces that would otherwise be underutilized. I won't go into all of these, but this is just a little snapshot from different places across the urban food bowl. But yeah, really inspiring places. And we also exist within a context of institutions that enable us to do what we do. So places like Sustain, which does so much work in the policy space, that has such trickle-down effects to what we do. But then also like avenues of selling what we produce, so Fair Food, which is Series, which we do wholesale to, but also Open Food Network, and on a smaller scale, Healthy Fresh Food Boxes in Brunswick. And then there's also organizations that highlight and try to provide opportunities. So Young Farmers Connect and Growing Farmers are 2 groups, again, within the operating on Wurundjeri country, that help to provide opportunities for farmers, and especially young farmers like myself, because it is a tough industry to get into, especially if you're not inheriting land. And there are many potentials for what we do in terms of using underutilized space to create these pockets of food production, but also, and probably more importantly, community. So we've got Farm Raiser, which is a kind of sister farm of ours. They operate on Department of Education land as part of Waratah Special Development School. And you can see their farm here. So they run a food box program that involves the children from the school. And we're working to create pathways from that special development school onto our social enterprise. You've also got Faulkner Food Bowls that converts that's just converted food bowl land into growing space. And then you've got places like Fairshare that use donated land, in the instance of Bagley Farm, which was a former flower farm that was donated to the organisation to run a market garden. But you also they run a Victoria Park, which operates on Vic Rail land in Abbotsford, adjacent to a train station. And also they run a market garden in Moorabbin Airport. So huge opportunities in the use of what is currently vacant land. But we are operating within a food system that Nick mentioned, that highly undervalues and especially underprices the cost of growing food regeneratively or with little to no impact on the land. The only reason that we can operate is because we have a hybrid between support, disability support, and food production. And many of these urban farms have those kind of dual social missions. That means that they're available, that philanthropic funding is available to them. Otherwise, it is an incredibly tough market to operate in. And it is probably the most disheartening thing for me to see idealistic young farmers get churned out time and time again. And then I guess on a broader scale, and this is just my own reading, but thinking about what localized food systems look like practically going into the future. They've got Food for Degrowth on the right and a paper that came out of, I think, University of Adelaide down the bottom, both of which giving different perspectives of what food growing in our urban and peri-urban, on the right, the instance of Melbourne, and on the left, the instance of Adelaide, what that would look like in practice. And essentially the takeaway for me is that there is just not enough land within our urban and peri-urban, if we're going in a very bio-intensive way of growing, to be able to sustain our metropolitan population. So we need to continue to have food growing spaces outside of that, and what that kind of what that model looks like, I think, is a conversation for later. Anyway, a couple of hiccups, but really appreciate being able to share what we do and the context that we operate in. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Callum. And please be reassured that even without the slides, your talk was excellent, and we knew exactly, we were painting a picture in our mind, so it's all good. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
And we'll come back. There's been a couple of lovely comments, but we'll come back to all of that in a moment. So, excuse me. Now, if my buttons work well, I will do a perfect transition between Callum and Henry. So I'm spotlighting you now, Henry, and I'll take you off the spotlight for a little while, Callum. So Henry Coleman works with Local Futures, and it was really lovely to have him come and join us, given it's Local Futures who have been the catalyst. Helena Norberg-Hodge, who spoke in our webinar on Monday night, one of the main catalysts for celebrating localization and creating World Localisation Day. So Henry, over to you to share with us. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Yeah, good to be here. Local Futures, we're an international, small but international NGO promoting localization. So a lot to kind of, can seem like a paradox. World Localisation Day can seem like a paradox, but it's not if you consider the need for localization globally and for the need for collaboration internationally and interregionally to bring about localization, because we are talking about structural change at an international level, as well as a global grassroots movement of organizations, many of which have already been talked about today in the Australian context, creating new economies from the bottom up. So yeah, just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Henry Coleman. I've been working with Local Futures for a very long time, considering I'm kind of still a baby in this space. I came into contact with Local Futures work when I was 26. I'm 26 now. When I was 15 years old, through their film, The Economics of Happiness. And for me, what that did was relieve me of an idea that I had had and been very depressed by as a child, that we could either have ecological well-being or development, progress, and human well-being. That there was this kind, and I still feel like this idea pervades, at a subtle level, pervades the conversation around climate, around development, around economics, that we can that it's a payoff between these two things. And what the documentary Economics of Happiness showed me was that that is not the case, and particularly by looking at the food system. But if we localize our food economies, the fact is we can produce more food per acre, we can create more livelihoods, more jobs, and more meaningful livelihoods, jobs that are centered in community and varied, and it's very different to kind of farming in the industrial system, while at the same time we can increase biodiversity, sequester carbon, rebuild soils, and massively reduce resource consumption and waste and pollution and emissions. So there is this win-win-win, and that kind of reminds me to address what Callum just ended with. And yeah, sorry, I wanted to thank Callum and Nick for their presentations. I thought they were both amazing. Yeah, a lot I can learn about the Australian context from those. But what I was going to get to was, yeah, Callum was ending on this idea of, yeah, we can't grow all the food for urban populations in urban and peri-urban spaces. So what do we mean when we say localization? How localized can we be practically? And what I wanted to highlight in that context is that currently we have an economy that imports and exports identical quantities of identical products. We have an economy of insane trade. We have, last year, Germany was the world's second largest importer of milk, as well as the world's second largest exporter of milk. The US imported $3.5 trillion worth of beef, and trillion or billion, far out, I'm not so good with numbers. 3.5 something dollars worth of beef, and imported 3.75 something dollars worth of beef. I can check that in my notes. That's a bit embarrassing, but okay. And we have this situation going on globally. Australia is importing, exporting oranges, importing, exporting meat, wheat, water to the UK, bottled water, 20 tons to the UK, 20 tons back from the UK. We have this insane global swapping of food commodities. And so when we talk about localization, we are also, when it doesn't have to be, some kind of radius, some kind of, we must get all our food within these requirements. No, we're talking about shortening the distances between producer and consumer wherever possible. And when we do that in the food economy, we're creating a situation where we're stimulating diversification on the land. And this is a really, really important point. The global market operates, pressures farmers to produce vast quantities of standardized products for an export market, for a global market. A local economy, say a farmer's market, cannot deal with hundreds of tons of straight carrots, perfectly straight carrots to fit the bill for the supermarkets that might sit in an enormous refrigerator for 8 months. That's not what the local market does. The local market wants variety. So it incentivizes farmers to diversify their production, which incentivizes a shift away from monoculture farming, factory farming, which is extremely resource intensive and destroying the soil. We know that topsoil is being lost at a very unsustainable rate. Some studies will say it's 16 times the natural rate of replenishment. We move away from that very destructive system, high input system, towards diversified systems. So we work with farmers markets in the area that I'm from, in the Northern Rivers in New South Wales, where farmers have moved away from producing a commodity for the supermarkets, 1 or 2 products, into producing 20 different kinds of products. And what that does is both socially and ecologically extremely beneficial. When we talk about regenerative agriculture, what we really need to be focusing on is not the term regenerative, which we can see that being co-opted for corporate, to suit the corporate bill. We'll just throw a crop cover on the land and call it regenerative. No, we need to be looking at diversity, because diversity above ground and below ground, i.e. what's being grown and raised and what's in the soil, is absolutely foundational to restoring biodiversity, to managing pests and weeds without the use of toxic chemicals. And as I say, growing more food per acre, actually being more productive. But what that requires is more hands and eyes per acre. It requires more human beings in the system rather than technology, machines and chemicals. We'd be talking about a much more significant proportion of people actively involved in primary production. So not only in food systems, but also in forestry and in fiber. And this clearly can be a good thing, like what Callum was sharing about with the reintegration of community, with the social benefits that come from working together for a productive cause, for a meaningful cause. The benefits of that in terms of healing, in terms of mental health, in terms of community cohesiveness, in terms of overcoming the divisions between the social divisions between old and young, different races, different genders. That reweaving of community through productive livelihoods on the land is an incredible benefit. It means more jobs. So we are looking at, boosting the number of jobs while actually restoring biodiversity and reducing resource use. So again, that comes back to that point that I started with. It's a win-win. Localization is a win-win, ecologically and economically and socially. So obviously what we'd need are very different economic supports. So when we talk about an economic shift, when we talk about localization as a process, the mechanisms of that process are economic mechanisms, namely subsidies, taxes, and regulations. The current economy, in the current economy, those mechanisms that governments use, that policymakers use to shape the economy, are being used to favor large-scale production for export markets. And this has been the case since the beginning of the colonial project, and especially in the era of globalization. Subsidies, taxes, and regulations have been funneled into making food from the other side of the world cheaper than food grown down the road. And that is an artificial situation. I really want to stress that's an artificial situation. When you walk into Woolworths and the prices are like whatever they are, those price tags are artificial. They're the product of policies that have subsidized, for example, the telecommunications infrastructure used for barcode technology, the satellites, the research and development into the chemicals. And this continues. Now governments, including the Australian government, are putting money into encouraging farmers to adopt AI in farming, robots managing the land and measuring the soil, and they call it precision agriculture, and it's all dressed up in the right language of biodiversity and regenerative. But it's a continuation of the same system of technology being subsidized to run the land and actually pushing farmers off the land. And this is most extreme in the global south. So where still 50% of the population in global south countries are living in more localized economies, and these are the places that are now being at the forefront of a corporate project to manage the land using satellites and robots and data. And it's a very scary trajectory, and it's very mineral intensive and very resource intensive, and it's all being subsidized. And then there are the regulations that are imposed through free trade treaties, largely free trade treaties, that will criminalize the use of, criminalize particular ways of doing things that are deemed, for health and safety reasons. Small scale production is no longer allowed. The making cheese in what's it called? I forget the word, but and that has to be done in stainless steel, so that destroys small farmers. And this has also been a process that's been going on through the era of globalization. Regulations have been imposed that destroy small farmers and work in the favor of the big guys. So this is all big picture stuff, but it's like bringing back that recognition that we can create a very different economy if we make different decisions with subsidies, taxes, and regulations. We could subsidize housing for small farmers. We could encourage research and development into localized place-based ways of producing food. We could subsidize agroforestry. We could, build regulations that support small shops and the small businesses that are connected to the local farming, the local food system. limit rent raises and give tax benefits. And there are ways that we can use the economy to make local food cheaper and more accessible for the majority of the population. So that's what we're talking about with food system localization, using those structures, those mechanisms in a very different way. That's at a kind of structural level, economic level. And what we're also raising awareness about with World Localization Day and in Local Futures work is the incredible plethora of initiatives that are grassroots and that are doing things right now to rebuild local food economies, to grow local jobs, to grow more food per acre, to support biodiverse farming systems. These initiatives are taking off across the world, and we don't hear about them in the mainstream media. We are lucky enough to hear about them in the two presentations that we've just heard. And I love those slides where you're highlighting the network of organizations that are involved in this. Am I coming up to time, Michelle?
Yes, you are. Well spotted.
Okay, cool. Thanks. I'll wrap up. Yeah, so World Localization Day is making visible that grassroots plethora of initiatives that's doing this despite, against the grain of the dominant economy, and how inspiring that is, that people are doing this out of their own goodwill, wisdom, and perseverance. And if those initiatives were identified and supported by policymakers, how quick that shift could be, how rapid that shift towards a more sustainable and genuinely sustainable, genuinely regenerative, and genuinely well society, how quick that shift could be. So that's what we're celebrating with World Localization Day. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, huge thanks to Michelle for your ongoing work. It's great to be involved with NENA. Give me a lot of hope. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Henry. And I have to say, whether it was $1 billion or $1 trillion worth of the swapping of products, don't ever be embarrassed. Any number that big that any nation state is importing and exporting, it's all sort of pretty terrifying and terrible. So yes. I'm wondering actually if we can take immediately from some of Henry's comments about the need for really building this different policy and legal framework and go straight to your work, Nick, in really looking at these systems and looking at the recommendations in the Australian context. So what Henry was very kindly doing was sort of explaining and reminding us how the international trade system is a huge problem. And I think many of us know that. The nitty-gritty of it is a bit tricky, though. Nick, can you perhaps sort of segue from what Henry was talking about with the need for regulatory reform and talk specifically in the Australian context about even just one or two examples of what we need in Australia to support local farms and local growing of food better?
Sure. Yeah, so just thanks, Henry and Callum, for the great presentations. So yeah, just I guess a couple of really clear examples where there are roadblocks in the way of food systems that actually enhance human and ecological well-being. So in the urban context in Melbourne, and I think it's no different in Australia's other big cities, we talk about food swamps. This is a term that came in the literature a few years back now, and what it describes is a spatial phenomenon in the food retail environment, and it's particularly noticeable in the outer urban areas of cities, which is where housing tends to be more affordable. And it's a very clear strategy on the part of the corporations, and here I'm talking about the fast food industry in particular, as well as supermarkets, the big supermarkets, to concentrate significant numbers of franchises and fast food outlets in shopping centres and along major thoroughfares in our outer urban suburban areas. And so food swamp describes the ratio of unhealthy to healthy food outlets. And Deakin researchers in 2020, I think it was, reported that in various areas around Melbourne, that ratio had nearly doubled, gone up by 92% over just a 10-year period from 2008 to 2018. The reason that is happening, and it's a policy failure, or perhaps a fast food friendly policy environment, we might also think of it in those terms, is that in our state planning framework in Victoria, when the planning authorities, in this case local governments, come to make their decisions about whether to grant planning approval to new businesses, they are not allowed to take into account the health and well-being impacts of those businesses. Here I'm going right back to my days doing an undergraduate law degree in administrative law. And when decision makers make decisions legally, they have to take into account relevant considerations. They cannot take into account irrelevant considerations. So this was tested back in 2013 in the Yarra Ranges, in the very famous or infamous McDonald's in the Tacoma region, where McDonald's was going to open a new franchise right across the road from a primary school, which is what they often do. The community didn't want it, the school didn't want it. They protested, or all kinds of community campaigns to protest that. The local government, Yarra Ranges Shire Council, agreed with the community and refused planning permission. And the company promptly took them to VCAT, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and said, you have made it an error in taking into account the health and well-being and ecological impacts of our business. Under the legislation, under the planning framework, you're not allowed to do that. And the tribunal said, exactly right, irrelevant consideration, council, you've made an error of law. You have to give planning approval to McDonald's to open that restaurant. And that still to this day is a major gap in the planning framework. So that's one example. Another clear one at the federal level, and again, a huge, if we think about the supermarket duopoly, the impacts that has on farmers and the general food system, the way it crowds out smaller producers, local food businesses, greengrocers, and so on. Why do we have a supermarket duopoly in Australia? Surely we have competition laws that stop us from having this, well, it's a duopoly, two companies that own or control 70% plus of the market. Not good, even within the capitalist paradigm, not good for healthy competition, you would think. This was tested back in 2008 at the federal level with a competition inquiry, and they were not, again, the way the laws work, they're not allowed to look at the impacts of this business on farmers and on suppliers. They're looking at it purely from the perspective of the consumer and whether the consumer is getting a cheap price. And they said that the model was workably competitive from the consumer perspective. Doesn't matter that farmers are getting squeezed, doesn't matter that farmers are getting the same price for their produce they got 30 years ago. As long as the consumer is getting a good deal, it's all good as far as our competition framework is concerned. So those are two really clear examples of a massive failure in regulation. And to pick up Callum's point, this is why we need, democratic and participatory policy making, so that we as community members, as taxpayers, as ratepayers actually get to have a say in these kinds of decisions and shaping these laws and frameworks.
No, fantastic. Thanks, Nick. Well, not fantastic, utterly depressing. Before we start, we will come back now to the local projects that you guys were talking about and how absolutely inspiring they are. But just quickly, Nick, are there any jurisdictions in Australia doing better than others that we could look to in terms of allowing communities to have greater control over what's going on in the food planning scheme? Or are all the jurisdictions pretty terrible at the moment?
Well, I've just seen somebody say that in the Blue Mountains there were defeats of Maccas, so that's good. If that happens, that's very encouraging. In terms of I guess enabling frameworks and participatory policy making, I think Mary Beck in Melbourne is doing a really good job there. Food system strategy is now in its second iteration, and they've created a food leadership action group that works as a local food network alongside council in the implementation of that and making decisions about resourcing, almost a bit like the participatory budgeting framework that Brazil pioneered, many years ago now. So I think that's a really good example. City of Yarra next door have for many years had an urban agriculture council community committee that works alongside staff and with urban farmers and community gardeners to shape the development of the urban agriculture space in the City of Yarra. So yeah, there are some places where it's where local government is responsive to what communities want and tries to create frameworks to enable it to happen.
Within the realm of what they're allowed.
But yeah, we need much more engagement from the state government. And I can point to Tasmania. Actually, Tasmania created a food security action plan in 2021, and they've created a statewide food security network that we're linking up with. So, down in Tassie, they're doing some really good work at the state level to progress this issue.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt, but as you were saying, many councils are trying, but they are hampered by what the state government allows them to do within those planning laws. But thank you. We have a question, and I'm not sure, I've been following all the chat, but I'm not sure if this question was answered somehow in there, but I'm going to put it to you anyway. Warwick asked, how easy is it to economically, sorry, I've got a cat on my desk, which is trying to push my computer off. I do apologize. If I fall off the chair, you know why, it's a big cat. How easy is it to economically recycle the vital nutrients such as phosphorus in our sewage? I think that question came up, Nick, when you were talking about urban agriculture, but maybe it's a general question. And then Tonier very kindly popped in a comment going, I thought human urine could be directly applied to soil. I'm not even going to go into all that science detail stuff, but I wonder if one of you could comment on anything to do with that, these issues, urban agriculture, human waste generally, anything?
I'll just put in
Callum, and then I'll go to Henry. Yep.
There was a recent episode in a podcast called No-Till Market Gardening, which is like probably the biggest podcast for small-scale agriculture. And the most recent episode was about the use of urine in small-scale agriculture. I won't go into the details, but that goes into it quite thoroughly.
Okay, I wonder, Callum, if you could pop in the chat or send to me the link to that podcast. That sounds like it might be of interest. And Henry, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, basically that if you look at a localized society, and our work at Local Futures came out of experience of seeing a really intact indigenous culture in northern India called Ladakh, in a very resource poor area, resource poor. They were composting all of their human waste, and actually it was the foundation for a very productive, highly productive local food system. Composting human waste and animal waste and building up the soil, building up the topsoil in a desert. And so I just want to call attention to the fact that I think if we look at really healthy localized societies, we would be talking about a shift away from urbanization and the building up of smaller towns and smaller cities where they're just of a scale where composting even of food scraps is possible, because you can't do that in a megalopolis like modern Beijing or Sydney. Like we need to be talking about smaller scale living structures where we can actually be wiser in our use of resources. Large scale is blind to wise use of resources, whereas the smaller scale, more local, more place-based areas can solve these problems on a case-by-case, place-adapted basis, on a with bioregional variations. That I think we do need to be looking at a shift away from large-scale urban living to really be truly sustainable. It's just the point I wanted to make.
Thank you, Henry. Nick, you wanted to make a response?
Yeah, just on the question of human waste, there is that's already happening in Melbourne with retreated water, water retreatment plants. There are issues with the quality of the water. We've been engaging with Werribee South Market Gardens out in Melbourne's west, which is one of Melbourne's food bowls, produces 10% of our vegetables on 0.002% of the land, 3,000 acres, 10% of our veg. They do use retreated water, but they're unhappy with the quality. The quality is quite variable, so there's a lot of room for improvement there. But I think this does raise the question about technology and scale and those kind of things. And I personally, don't think we can wind back the clock and go back to kind of pre-industrial, pre-urban ways of living necessarily. I just don't know that that's going to be realistic in a world population the way we are. But we can certainly live better in cities, and we can certainly orient our economies in ways that prioritize human health and ecological health. And that brings up the question of, capitalism and growth dynamics. For me, is what are we actually prioritizing? And that's the conversation I think that's rapidly emerging, that we increasingly need to be having. And I know that is something that NENA is working along and has been for some time.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't resist as you were talking to give a quick plug. The NENA conference this year in November is literally looking at life after capitalism. What does it look like to live in a society that has many of the same things we have today, but manages the vast accumulation of wealth in the small hands, there could be small hands, in the hands of a small group of people. Sorry, quick segue into a commercial break by Michelle Maloney. Nick, both Nick and Henry, you've raised some really important issues, which unfortunately I don't think we're going to have time to go into today, because Nick actually has to leave in 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll wrap up a few minutes after that. But we are hearing, I've been hearing for many years, sort of this discussion about how much can we really do in highly urbanized societies. Some people think that urban farming will save the world. Others say it absolutely will not. I'm always a great believer in the middle way, like it probably won't, but it'll do a huge amount of good. And I certainly love that vision that Nick shared from, I think it was a Barkindji Indigenous person, saying they look across the rooftops of buildings and other places and think, this is country, why can't we make it greener? And I actually heard another Indigenous person speaking in Yugambeh country about exactly the same thing. They look out across the Gold Coast, shake their head for so many reasons, but also think this place could be a whole lot greener. So maybe we just press pause on that, but raise it as an issue. And given Australia has, and I could be wrong, something like 88% of Australians live on the coastal fringe, and within that, there's a mass proportion of us living in cities. I know our cities aren't as big as some of the really massive places in the other parts of the world, but this is a huge issue for Australia. How do we care for country, care for each other, look after the place, but also have something good to eat? And I think that wonderful mix, and that brings you back to the next question for Callum, I think, but for Callum and Nick particularly in Australia. What I wanted to know is, I know that since COVID, we've been seeing an increase in people wanting to grow their own food, but can you talk a little bit, perhaps to give us all hope and encouragement, about the growth of not just the understanding, but actual urban farming, peri-urban use of land? Is it just happening in Victoria? Are you seeing it in other places? Can we be excited by all these urban carrots and such?
Nick can talk about the context outside of Melbourne, but at least I know from hands-on experience, the pandemic saw a huge increase, not only in interest, but in projects happening. Much of Caring Farms Cooperative, the thing that I'm a part of, was born out of all of our wages being subsidised during the lockdowns, but still being able to operate because we're food producers. So that goes to show what different financial models can mean for the development of enterprises. I think, unfortunately, as these things go, there was a drop in interest and participation as the lockdowns ended. But as there continues to be future shocks to the system, I think we'll just see the interest increase again. We saw it prior to COVID with the fires. Lots of what we were producing took on more value to people, especially the fresh food. And I can see that occurring time and time again as we go into our very scary future.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. It's very encouraging. And I guess, look, there's a number of other questions and comments in there, but a couple of them are asking about regulatory capture. And I think through all the talks today, and by me highlighting onto Henry and Nick, this idea of the policies and regulations we have in this country that do or don't support, urban farming, local farming, these are things that we can all get involved in. And before you go, Nick, I wonder, are there any particular advocacy or specific projects or campaigns at the moment that people can get behind to support you and others in your work around law reform or policy reform for food in Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Mish. I just quickly picking up on what Callum was talking about, that question. The two links I just shared there are books. One that I co-edited with Andrea Gaynor, who's a fantastic environmental historian from University of Western Australia in Perth. That was published in 2018, Reclaiming the Urban Commons, which talks about case studies from around the country of urban farms and community gardens. That was written and researched in 2017-18. So the space is definitely expanding. I'd definitely echo what Callum was saying. There was a big upsurge in COVID and lockdown, but it's kind of died off a little bit. But it's there, and it has been there for well over 100 years. And this is the other link, Andrew Gaynor's 2006 book, Harvest of the Suburbs, which is really her PhD turned into a book looking at the urban food growing in Perth and Melbourne over the last 120 years plus. We've always grown food in cities, and it's waxed and waned at different historical periods. The Victory Gardens in World War II was a real flourishing of urban food production. And I think it's dependent on context and external drivers, and it's something that people instinctively come to and wish to do, and I think increasingly so. And I think the more that we create enabling frameworks for them to do that, the more that we make access to land available, the more that we provide skills and resources and capacity, the more it will be done. It's about us, engaging at different levels, growing food ourselves, but also engaging in the policy space. So that other link there, the vicfoodsystem.org.au, that is a policy agenda that we and others mapped out in 2021, a consensus statement for the transformation of Victoria's food system. Encourage, if you're here representing an organisation, you can show your support for that statement by going on that website. In New South Wales, there was a great inquiry that was done by independent MP for Sydney, Alex Greenwich. The last link I've shared there is to that inquiry, a really great report mapping out a similar vision and agenda for food systems change in New South Wales. No worries. So I was saying that, in New South Wales, there was a really terrific quite open parliamentary inquiry that was done last year, and a great report that's there, which I'd encourage everyone to have a look at if you're interested in the policy space. Our federal government right now has a food security inquiry open for submissions at the federal level, Future of Food in Australia. Have a look at that website, get in there, make your submission. I think they're receiving submissions right now. You can see who else has there and made submissions. We have, many others have. Make your voice known, let the politicians in Canberra know what you're thinking. And if you are in Victoria, we are wanting to put some pressure on the state government down here by basically encouraging them to do what was done in New South Wales and have a parliamentary inquiry. So we're engaging with members of what's called the Environment and Planning Committee, in the upper house of the Victorian Parliament. We've drafted a terms of reference, and we want that committee to initiate an inquiry into food security and food systems in Victoria. And we've already met with some members of that committee. And yesterday, in fact, in the Victorian government, Dr Sarah Mansfield, MP, Greens for Western Victoria, put forward a notice of motion basically saying that, you know, access to good food is a basic human right, and calling on the Victorian government to legislate and recognise that right. So that's hot off the press from yesterday in the Victorian Parliament. So yeah, if you want to get more involved or know more about this, I'll just leave my email again if anyone wants to follow up.
And what I might do, Nick, is grab some of those more urgent things and put them on the NENA website under our food hub as well. So Nick, I think you have to dash. So what I might do is say a huge thank you to you, but I did want to give Henry an opportunity to give a bit of a plug for localization webinars today and tonight. But Nick, please feel free to jump off if you have to or stay on, but a huge thank you. Always, your knowledge about what's been going on in Australia is always unreal. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Nick. I know he's got to dash to another meeting. But Callum and Henry, let's wrap up in a less rushed way. Henry, did you want to mention the World Localisation Day webinar tonight? And I was trying to find a link, but I've just been juggling too many things. So
yeah, awesome. Thank you, Michelle. So good to you remind me to do these things. Very important. Yeah, so World Localisation Day is today. So please, you know, the idea is just to make visible and strengthen the worldwide movement that already exists for localization in its plethora of different forms all over the world. So head to worldlocalizationday.org, and I'm going to put in the link for the humanities link for our call tonight, which is called Localizing Globally, Building a Worldwide Movement. And that's happening tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern time.
And I'll be on there, so please join us. We're having a big chat about localizing things. So yes. Yeah,
so Michelle will be sharing about what's going on in Australia, but we'll have people, you know, because it's the kind of Eastern Hemisphere time zone, a lot of voices from different parts of Asia. And yeah, just sharing about what this movement looks like in all of these different parts of the world, what needs to be done to strengthen it into a cohesive international force for structural change. And that comes to some of the points that we were talking about. Like, obviously, regulatory change and political change is needed. And I think what's really empowering about that is that the building of localized systems, of localized food systems, localized economies, it's creating resilience locally and it's reconnecting people locally. But what that also does is to create the very fabric that's needed to empower people politically, because we can't go about this alone. We can't change the economic system alone. We have to build a movement, and that movement is made tangible by the localization in our own communities, in our own places, and the connection of those local networks into regional and international networks. And that's what World Localization Day is about. So yeah, you could check out worldlocalizationday.org, where there's all of these voices and stories from around the world listed. There's a film we made last year about the movement available there for free. And yeah, the humanities event, 7 p.m. tonight Eastern time would be great to see you there.
Thank you, Henry. And Callum, I'm just about to do a plug for some of our other events this coming week, and also mention to folks we're about to launch the program for our Degrowth Week, which is in July. But before I get onto any of those commercial breaks, did you want to share any updates with your work before I say thank you to both of you?
Nothing really to plug. Unless you live in the Greensboro area, you probably won't see us. But all I would say is go buy from your local farm.
Absolutely. Yes, I've just moved to a new area and I've been searching and searching for the local food system. So that's definitely been on my radar at the moment. Well, look, I just want to say you don't have to leave just yet, but I do want to say a huge thank you to both of you. Really, it's been a wonderful conversation today, strengthening our connections and understandings at the local level, but also hearing from Henry about what's going on more internationally. But just very quickly, before everyone jumps off, I just wanted to mention, and for anyone who's been following the activities we've been up to, what the website, if you go to the homepage of neweconomy.org.au, you'll find a button for Localisation Week. The recording for our Monday night discussion is already up. That was Helena Norberg-Hodge, John Jandai from Thailand, and myself talking about what localisation is, what's going on, and then some particular stories from different places. Yesterday, we had a really powerful conversation with people from places that have been affected really badly in the recent years by fires and floods, but just amazing stories of different groups and how they're responding, how they're strengthening community relationships and so on. So the recording for yesterday and probably today will be up in the next day or two. Tomorrow at lunchtime, we've got local solutions to Australia's housing crisis with some really fantastic members of the NENA Human Habitats Hub. It's many, many H's. These are some of the folks involved with the NENA Housing Week that we've been running each year. And then, as I mentioned, it'll be a really big discussion. There's going to be a whole bunch of housing researchers on that call. And then Friday, we'll be pondering how to rearrange society and how we can be inspired by one of the world's oldest continuous cultures and their rather remarkable governance system. So I'm looking forward to that conversation with Mary. And it'll be reflecting on some of the work we're exploring in our book together on the relationist ethos. So I do feel like a walking commercial today, but on that note, I'm going to say thank you for your time and attention. Thank you to our speakers. And yeah, as Callum said, go forth, buy locally, do stuff locally, including snoozing. Naps and snoozing are good on a nice afternoon like today. Anyway, we can dream. Thank you so much, everybody. And we'll see you again soon, I hope. Bye, Callum. Bye, Henry.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much, Michelle. And yeah, the upcoming events look awesome. So thanks for being a walking advertisement.
Only for the good stuff, baby. Thanks, everyone. Might see some of you tonight. Okay. Bye. Thank you.